In Stephenville, they picked this large object up on radar, and based on the radar tracks, it was traveling over 1,000 miles per hour. And so that's well above supersonic speed. They wouldn't look at humans as a single entity. I think they would look at the largest organisms on the planet. I think are going to be like your nation states. And I think they behave like anything else on this planet, which is basically kill or be killed. I think you need people like me. Like I'm not scared to publish whatever I want. I'm not beholden to anyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Watch Mojo's Unveiled podcast. I am your host, Rob. And before we jump into it, this is your reminder that Unveiled is available on all podcast platforms. So if you like to listen on Apple, Google, Spotify, Pandora, wherever, Unveiled is available. So if you're watching on YouTube, click the link in the description and follow us on one of those platforms. And if you're listening already on one of those audio platforms, why not leave a rating and a review? It really helps us out to grow the show and continue allowing us to bring you interviews with leading experts in the field of UAPs and other mysterious phenomena. My guest today is Chris Lehto. He is a retired F-16 fighter pilot, and he has since turned his attention to UAP research. He now operates the Lehto Files YouTube channel, and he joins me today to talk about his experience in the Air Force, as well as his takes on UAP disclosure and lots more. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having me.
It's great to talk to you. I'm really interested in your background as a fighter pilot, so maybe we can start there. What is it that got you interested in UAPs from the perspective of somebody flying planes in the sky all the time?
Yeah, it was really after I retired. So when I was in the Air Force, I get the question a lot, did you ever see anything when you were flying? And no, I never saw anything that I couldn't identify within some amount of time, right? You're all the time, you're seeing things, you question yourself all the time just to make sure that you're not wrong. Is that plane turning left or is it turning right? It's not easy to tell when you're in the air at, large distances. And you're also using night vision devices, you're using other spectrums. You're always second guessing. But in my time as a fighter pilot, I never, or at least I don't remember any instances where I couldn't identify something, or it moved faster than I could imagine any sort of man-made tech moving. So really didn't even think of it at all when I was in the Air Force, and I was really, I believe the mainstream paradigm. You know, um, I got a material science degree at the Air Force Academy, and I've just always been interested in the nature of reality. I just always had that question of why am I here? Why do I have to go to school? Why do I have to get a job? Those sorts of questions. What is the nature of existence? And I didn't grow up religious, so I didn't really have any sort of good, or I guess solid metaphysical grounds. And so I've just always been interested in that. And then when I retired from the Air Force, I moved, like we were chatting before, moved with my family to Portugal, and I wanted to do something that could keep me busy, and some sort of career or job where you're always learning and you don't have a boss necessarily, although the audience is definitely the boss in many ways. And I just happened to see the Gimbal video as well as listen to David Fravor's account of the Tic Tac. And he spoke directly to me. I related to him very easily. He seemed like one of the leaders that I had known. I didn't know him. He was in the Navy. I was in the Air Force. But he seemed exactly like all of the honorable, incredible military leaders that I worked with, the Top Gun instructors, those people who are just professional aviators and professional warriors, if you will. And so when he gave that account, it just seemed completely credible to me and really flipped my world around. So after I heard Fravor's account, it really kind of opened my eyes that there could be other possibilities to all the mainstream arguments that I believed my whole life, but still didn't provide any good answers. We still had so many unanswered questions across all the sciences. I'm really always been interested in sciences. So I started looking into it. And whenever I made videos about the objects, about David Fravor, about the gimbal, about Go Fast and Flare One, then that's when it resonated with people. And then my channel went, small time viral, if you will, but at least way more views than I had before. and that's what they seem most interested in. So that kind of drew me into the subject. I wouldn't say kicking and screaming, but I never planned to be like a UAP investigator, and I consider myself an investigator of the nature of reality. It's not just UFOs, you know. So that's really how I got into it.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I often hear is that the phenomenon is a lot bigger than just objects in the sky, and it ties into a lot of things that we've learned about psi phenomena and things that you explore in depth on your channel. But going back to your career, I'm curious to know what the discourse was like, if there was any, about objects in the sky amongst pilots, or was this something that was not really spoken about?
It was never talked about, which was really interesting after I got out and when I started looking into the subject, and I learned just how close or in a really direct way the US Air Force investigated UFOs. You know, you had so many programs going back. Project Blue Book is, you know, obviously the most, um, I guess, the most recent, right? Until ATIP, but they really looked into UFOs and have been directly implicated in a lot of instances. You know, you have particularly like Phoenix Lights. I did my F-16 training at Phoenix, and I was there in 2004, so 2003, 2004, and Phoenix Lights were the late 90s. I want to say 97, if I get that wrong. Sorry. Um, but either way, within a decade, and I didn't hear a single thing about it. You know, we never talked about it, never mentioned it. It never came up. And then allegedly, they actually launched fighters from Luke Air Force Base to actually intercept the Phoenix Lights. And you also have down in Stephenville. That's another famous case. I didn't find out till I started looking into it. But basically, that's, again, I'm terrible with dates, but I believe 2007. I want to say it was Crawford Ranch down in Texas, and you basically had a large UFO picked up on radar going towards um, George Bush's ranch. You know, where he spent a lot of time out in Texas, out in Crawford, Texas, and they have this large contact going very fast on radar. And I learned later that they actually launched up to, I believe, 16 F-16s, maybe more, from Dallas. So that they've actually launched F-16s initially. Right when that event happened, the Air Force denied it and said, no, we didn't launch any aircraft. And then it came out later that, yes, actually did. They launched a lot of fighters from Dallas to go and check out what this object is, because obviously you don't want any sort of object going towards the president. There's always a cap, a close air patrol over the president wherever he is, which is interesting. So we heard nothing about it in the Air Force at all, and which is really interesting. Actually, once I got out, I thought that was notable.
Did you sense any sort of stigma surrounding the subject, or was it just something that people didn't really care about, or was it because the incidents were kind of few and far in between, that it wasn't really top of mind for people? What do you think the reason was for the lack of discussion about it?
Well, I guess I can't really answer it directly because I never came across it, not once. You know, I didn't hear anyone say anything about it, and I'm sure it's because of stigma, like without a doubt, because it's so difficult to make it to be a fighter pilot. You know, I had so many friends growing up, or when I was at the Air Force Academy. My roommate, his dream was to become a fighter pilot, but he couldn't because of his eyesight or some medical issue. I had another friend growing up. He always wanted to go to the Naval Academy and be a naval aviator, but he couldn't because he's colorblind. You know, another person. There's countless examples. You know, had a heart murmur. They couldn't do it. So it's very difficult to get in, even if you happen to, I don't know, get lucky or have the skills, or work hard enough to actually make it through the program. It's also just things that are out of your control, often physical related. And so pilots would never talk to the flight docs. You know, you would never voluntarily go and talk to the doctor. Um, they have since changed that, where I interviewed a flight doc. He was for NASA actually, and as I later in my career, they did change it to where the flight docs were more of friends, and they weren't out to just deniff or take the pilots off the flying schedule. But earlier, in the 90s and early 2000s, the flight docs did have a they had the general consensus was that if there was anything wrong with you, they're going to take you off the flying schedule, and then it's difficult to get back. So that's just in general. And then now, if you talk about any sort of mental issues, they will immediately, if anything comes up, they'll immediately pull your security clearance, and you can't fly a F-16 front. You can't fly any frontline fighter without a security clearance, and so you're immediately taken off the flying schedule for usually any sort of mental issue at all. So yeah, long story short, without a doubt, if anyone saw anything, they would not bring it up officially. Maybe mention to me, and as if it's a close friend, possibly mention it to me. But that never happened.
Do you think that's changing now that people like David Fravor have come forward and there's more public discourse about this type of thing? Do you think that the vibe is any different from when you were working?
Well, they can at least say the words now. They can say the word UAP, and I think it has to. We're still not seeing any reporting, open reporting from the Air Force, the Navy. They denied all Freedom of Information Act requests on UAPs, and so I think it's happened in the past with the military. Is the civilian world will want something to happen, but the military is just it's such an old conservative organization that it just takes a long time for it to change. It's just the boat is hard to change direction, the military boat. But that being said, Congress has passed laws now, so I think officially you do have protection, but unofficially, what goes on? We haven't seen like the fruit of that. We haven't seen a bunch of UAP cases come out. And then down in Eglin, there's a famous case where Paula Luna, she basically had to go to Eglin Air Force Base to try and look at a case where a major had intercepted what he considered a UAP, and they wouldn't let her talk to him. And so my feeling is that there's still a huge stigma that you're not going to want to bring it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tell me about the mind of a fighter pilot. How has your training influenced the way that you research now and analyze information about UAPs?
I'd say we're pretty varied people, actually, with different backgrounds, but usually all science backed. Not all. I did have a friend, he had a photography degree. He's a excellent fighter pilot. But I think what helped me probably the most was I went into flight safety investigation. So I really enjoyed that, actually, as you investigate crashes is kind of the main job, but then the main point is to try and make it so that there's no future crashes, right? So the point is to actually investigate what happened, which I enjoyed the most, which is looking into critical details, minute details, listening to witness reports, and trying to figure out something that happened in the past so that we can change it for the future. And so I think probably flight investigation or crash investigation helped me the most, really related to the cases and analysis. The other thing that really helped is the fighter debrief. So the flight debrief is extremely important. And I think the U.S. Air Force really, the Top Gun school, weapons school, and the Air Force really push forward the debrief as where you learn the most. So one mission, even if you're only flying for an hour to an hour and a half, it really takes probably 20 hours of total work around that 1 hour, to hour and a half. And a lot of it's pre-planning, to where you're planning the mission, planning what you're going to do, doing the briefing, coordinating with everyone. And then the other half of it is after the mission. So everything's recorded through different measures. A lot of it's through tapes. So that's one of the tapes you see in the gimbal, right? That's the targeting pod tape. And so in the F-16, we would actually have 3 tapes. So we'd have our targeting pod or other sensor. You'd have the radar as another screen, and then you have the heads-up display as one screen. as well as the overhead display. We also carry on the wing, they have a little GPS tracker, and that tracks exactly where the plane is in space, because it's basically a giant video game. So you're practicing tactics. A lot of it's air to air fighting, and so exactly where were you when you shot the missile, and then what are the kinematics of the missile, and so all of it's tracked. And so that all goes back to the debrief, and that's where you really spend a lot of time, and that's where the fighter pilots, I think, say they make all their money, is accurately reenacting what happened and then figuring out the lessons learned. So kind of the same thing. What happened? Figuring out they call it truth data. What's a truth data? Which doesn't really make sense. But as accurately as you can, what actually happened, and figuring out what went wrong, what could be done better, and then changing it and making it into lessons learned for the future. And so if each mission you get a little bit better, then after several years, you're going to be the best, right? That's the general consensus.
Seeing the gimbal video and the other ones that go fast, the tic tac, from a pilot's perspective, you must have seen this in quite a different way than any normal civilian would have. Can you describe some of those differences and what you might have picked up that the average person wouldn't?
Yeah, I think well, for the gimbal itself, I've since kind of changed my tune on the gimbal. Initially, like everyone else, I thought it was an amazing object, and even when it was turning, that was my whole argument: is that since you're in a turning engagement, I think this object is close, and if it's inside of 10 nautical miles, then I believe that proves that it's actually a UAP. And I spent this summer actually and did a lot of analysis using AI, building writing Python code, which I couldn't do before, but now I got AI to write Python code for me. And so I'm leaning towards actually that it could be further away actually. And so in that case, then it may not actually be a UAP. But like, I think when I first saw it right away, I'd stared at these targeting pods for so many hours, thousands of hours in different conditions, in night and day, in the weather, in clear, different altitudes. That to me, it's more like just looking through a camera. Something you like when you're looking at me right now. After so many hours, that's what you get used to. That how you observe the world. You're used to that, looking at a different spectrum, in an infrared spectrum. So I think right away it looked anomalous to me. I will say that we also beat it into our fighter pilots that you always need to change your spectrum. So meaning if you're looking at something, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is you don't know what something is. And that happened all the time, but you spend time to try and figure out what it is. And one of the main ways, especially when you're looking through a sensor, like a targeting pod or night vision goggles or something, where it's in a different spectrum, is you get from all different angles, all different zooms, and you should change to optical if you can, to go to a TV mode. So you'll notice in the gimbal that they do change from white hot, black hot. So they do change, but that doesn't actually change the spectrum that you're looking at. So that's still in the medium IR, which is still, it's liquid cooled infrared, right? It's not like your normal infrared, like your psionic stuff, that you're just the little handhelds. So it's a liquid cooled sensor. It's in medium infrared. But going from black hot to white hot just changes the pixels on the screen. It does help your brain break out differences. So we would always do that if you're normally a target on the ground. If you're looking at like a building or a set of buildings, it's difficult to break out what you're looking at based on the heat, because the top of the building will be hot, during the day. If part of the building's in the shade, it'll look cold. So what you do is you always team is left, we called it. You hit the switch to continually change the spectrum, or change black hot, white hot. But even better than that is you go to TV. So the targeting pods have a TV optical camera as well, which is a totally different sensor, especially the advanced ones. The older ones, when I first started, did not have a TV sensor, but the ones in the gimbal, the Go Fast, and the FLIR all had a TV mode. And so, unfortunately, gimbal. When I talked to Ryan Graves, he said it was later at night. It was during the evening, and so they didn't go to TV mode. I think also they were shocked what they were seeing. They weren't really prepared. and it wasn't beaten into them enough to go to TV. But that would have provided a huge amount of information if they could have just, even for just a second, gone to an optical mode. But it may have been dark. Even then, we would still go to optical at night to look at tankers. You can see lights you can pick up, so we would have known if there was lights in the thing. But what's encouraging is they did do that for FLIR 1, because Chad Underwood, he was prepared. If you remember, David Fravor saw the Tic Tac and then came back and landed on the carrier, and then he had a verbal he talked to Chad Underwood in between and said, "Hey, go get that thing on camera." And so Chad Underwood did he went through all of the sensors. So he went through the wide field of view, all of the IR modes and TV, I believe. And then he went to narrow field of view, which is a different camera, infrared. And then he swapped to TV mode as well. So that's why now I think the FLIR 1 is still the gold standard, because it looks exactly the same in infrared as it does in optical. And so that's a really good sign that what we're looking at is, like a flying, round container, Tic Tac looking object, is that it's the same in the infrared spectrum as it is in the optical spectrum.
We often hear people talking about the 5 observables, those being sudden acceleration, hypersonic speed, low observability, transmedium travel, and anti-gravity lift. Is there one that stands out to you as the most baffling out of those 5 observables?
Yeah, I think the acceleration is probably the one that really seals the deal, because anti-gravity lift, it's pretty hard to identify because we have so many balloons, right? I would say your number one object, it's not swamp gas anymore. They don't say it's swamp gas. That was back in Hynek's time. Now it's a balloon, because I can make a balloon out into any shape essentially, right? And it will always float. And they are difficult to identify. Like the Go Fast. Well, I can't prove it's not a balloon, and that's a big problem, right? Because the way I look at analyzing these things is I have to be able to prove that it's not a mundane object. If I can't prove it's not a mundane object, then then what's the point? It's basically it's probably a mundane object. So I think that instant acceleration, also hypersonic speeds without any sort of sonic boom, that's also a really good one. Because if you can prove that something is moving faster than the speed of sound, but it's not giving out any sort of sonic booms, I think that is also another really provable, observable, if you will. Like in Stephenville, they picked this large object up on radar, and based on the radar tracks, it was traveling over 1,000 miles per hour, and so that's well above supersonic speed down at the altitudes that they picked it up at. And so there should have been very loud sonic booms across that whole area. And the larger the object is, the louder the boom's going to be, because your shock wave's bigger. So a large object moving supersonic should, without a doubt, if it's interacting with our atmosphere, like everything we know exists should, then you should pick up a loud sonic boom. And so if there's no sonic boom and you prove this object is there, then I think that's a telltale sign of a UAP. I think it's provable. And if you can also prove that it goes from 0 to 1,000 faster than any object we know can, then I really think those two are kind of the big ones for me.
I want to ask you about your YouTube channel. So you've been working on it for the past few years. What is it that made you want to be a public voice talking about UAPs? Was there an incident in particular that inspired you?
I didn't plan to be a public voice in UAPs. I did start the YouTube channel. Well, one, I guess the main reason is that I just enjoyed watching YouTube videos, interesting videos from creators that really made me think. Really made me question. And so I thought that was, I always looked up to that as, something different, right? And so that encouraged me. And then I was just asking my kids one day what they wanted to be, and they said astronaut. I was like, wow, that's pretty good. I play it cool or whatever, or a YouTuber. And I was like, what? It's like, you could be a YouTuber right now. And they're like, whatever, dad. And I was like, you can, man, just start making videos. And they're like, whatever. So I was like, I could do it. And then so that kind of pushed me over the edge. Um, but really, it's about uh, finding knowledge and sharing that. I don't know. I think I've also written a few books in the past. I think whatever medium you're going to use, whether it's books or video or YouTube, for me, the draw was just sharing some perspective that you have on the world, because it made an impact on me. And then how I got into UAPs is it's just so curious. When David Fravor gave his story again on a podcast, right? He's talking to a YouTuber essentially. It totally changed my world, to have that sort of impact, and then to find out what's actually going on. I think you need decentralized investigators. You need people like us. I think you need people like me. Like, I don't. Um, I'm not scared to publish whatever I want. I'm not beholden to anyone, except the audience. They will crush you if you post something. But you need people like me just in their basement who don't care about the consequences, right? I don't care if I lose my advertisers because I barely have one. Like, I don't care. And I think a main problem with our current science and all the systems that I believe have allowed the UAP UFO subject to be stigmatized and kept in the dark is that so many people are beholden to the system. They're beholden to their companies, or they're beholden to their advertisers, or their colleagues, right? How many scientists out there will not publish anything on alternate science? They won't even consider looking into telepathy. I think you mentioned that. They won't even consider it. And it's because they're beholden to someone else. And so I think it's very important for people like me, and other people that start too. Watch Mojo just started doing a podcast in this venue, and it makes it harder for me, right? Because you're competing. You could probably do better. I'm sure your editing is better. But on the other end, I think it's very important that as many people enter as possible, because then we can't all be shut down. And so I think the decentralized investigation is really where we're gonna actually see some breakthroughs.
Yeah, and I see it as a very collaborative sort of thing too. It's like the rising tide lifts all ships. The more people that are talking about it, the more people get interested in it, and the more information is able to circulate. That's the way I look at it, at least. On the opposite end of the spectrum of people being beholden to the certain powers, there's a lot of noise too in the UAP discourse. So how do you separate the fact from the fiction? How do you keep things grounded, and how do you handle the responsibility of delivering good, valid information to your audience?
I don't know. um, from my viewpoint, the only thing I can do is try and be as truthful to myself. And if it's interesting for me and it's credible to me, then I publish it. At least with the caveats. Um, I'm sure I've published things that are incorrect. I know I've published things that are incorrect. I told you I changed my mind on the gimbal. I'd made many videos saying that I believed wholeheartedly that that's a UAP. This It's only the best we can do. And I do tell people that you have to listen. You can't just denounce everything. You can't just denounce Lou Elizondo because he was a counterintelligence agent, and you can't just denounce Jake Barber because he worked, in the Air Force. Like, at some point, you do have to consider where the information would come from. Like John Ramirez, he was a CIA analyst. So many people say that John Ramirez is lying, or once a CIA, always CIA. Or Jim Semivan, we talked about him before. He was a CIA managed operations desk for like 34 years. So you don't get more experience than that in the CIA, I think. But so people won't believe him because he was in the CIA. But at some point, are you just not going to believe anyone? Or I get comments before, all the time. I'm sure now that you're in the space, you'll get called a grifter for looking into this. You'll play some story, and they'll call you grifter for analyzing the story or publishing it. So it is a very difficult space that no matter what, you're going to get spears, and they've had verified disinformation campaigns in the past. Richard Doty was literally paid by the Air Force to spread lies and really disenfranchise UAP investigation, etc. So it's a very difficult topic. It's not easy to be an investigator in this. When I talk to people behind the scenes, everyone to a T pretty much we're in it because we're so interested, and the other thing is it would be the biggest story ever, right? It would by far be the biggest story. At least I consider it, if you can say that we're not alone, right? We're not alone in the universe. And I think unequivocally, we're not alone. I think it would be ridiculous to consider that as a viable option. That would be the weirdest answer would be we're all alone in a dead universe. That would be I put that at the absolute lowest probability. And yet, if you look, that's our number one mainstream argument. The mainstream idea that everyone believes, you get stigmatized for thinking otherwise, is that human consciousness, humanity is the lone consciousness in the entire giant, unimaginably large and varied universe. And so fact or fiction, I don't know. My best hope is that with enough sources, right, enough decentralized sources, it'll be like, machine learning, or how AIs find information, or how your brain does is through many different sources. And then it goes through filters. And then through really over time, time will weed out the fact from the fiction is my hope.
So not one big disclosure event, but more of a subtle kind of like spreading out of information until it's kind of just all out there and widely accepted by people. Is that the idea?
That's the only avenue I can see working at this moment. I was overly excited in the past. I've been in this, I guess it's my 5th year. And I remember saying, disclosures around the corner, we're getting it next year. And people got pissed about that, because it didn't happen. Surprise. And it hasn't happened for 80 years. And I think a lot has to change. You also mentioned that a lot of this dives into consciousness, the nature of reality, and I think that is completely true. I think if you look at any long-term serious UAP investigators, they always end up, veer, even if they start nuts and bolts only, they always veer into the woo, and even if they're not actively saying out in public, when they, in their books or whatever, that they're looking into the woo and consciousness, I guarantee they are. They may not publish it, but everyone that looks into this topic invariably ends up in that space. If you just look, take a cursory glance of, I don't know, any abduction event, it's going to be extremely strange. There's usually telepathic communication. Like, no aliens use their mouths. Basically, it's all. I've never heard an account where there is not telepathic communication. All the spaceships, people say it's realer than real, all the encounters. So it seems any of the direct witness accounts, witness testimonies, they're all woo related. There's very few just nuts and bolts. And so I think it undoubtedly, basically where it's led me is that I think we have a long way to go in our just understanding of the universe and reality in general. And so that's really where I'm focusing my efforts.
Yeah, that seems to be where a lot of people have the most trouble, is when it comes down to those kind of like non-physical this almost spiritual consciousness aspect of it. And you're totally right. I'm reminded of reading Lou Elizondo's book. One of the first things that he writes about is his experience in working in a remote viewing program. If we talk about Jake Barber right now with his organization Skywatcher, they're using psionics to invite UAPs to appear before them so they can measure them with their equipment. It's essentially tied very strongly with the UAP phenomenon. And that might be where a lot of people, I guess, can't really yet embrace, or that's where they don't, I don't know, fully get on board with the topic, because it's kind of like there's this other stigma. I mean, there's stigma about this entire thing, but the consciousness aspect is kind of relegated to I refer to it as like the that section of the bookstore, right? It's like that alternative religious, kind of pseudo religious side of things, which there's not much of a place for that in Western society. At least that's not how society works. What is it that you think has to change in order for more people to get on board with this and start taking it seriously?
I think we need a paradigm shift of our general scientific thinking. I think it's coming probably hopefully faster than most people suspect. I think we're seeing the cracks in the dam. I made a recent video just going through. If you look, there's actually the same amount, actually better statistical evidence for the Ganzfeld telepathy experiments than there is for the Higgs boson. But the Higgs boson, they get a Nobel Prize, even though you can't even look at the data, right? The raw data is not shared because it's too complex. But the Ganzfeld experiments, that data is all shared. And they use the same statistical analysis. They actually do a meta-analysis where you basically pair together two experiments to get a higher sigma. But that's looked down upon. That's called pseudoscience, right? Those telepathic experiments. And yet the Higgs boson, it gets Nobel Prizes and $50 billion in funding, and funds careers for our generations. So I think it's going to take time, barring some sort of mass event like Phoenix Lights. You could have that. And that, I guess they would call catastrophic disclosure. How would disclosure happen? You kind of mentioned the slow change, which now that I've been looking into this for fight, like I always wanted the catastrophic, I'd rather just rip the Band-Aid off. I was a fighter pilot, I'd rather just fly in there and bomb everything, which doesn't always help in business. But I think it's probably better for the planet if it's a slow disclosure over time, which is fine, even if it takes 50 years. It's really only one generation. But catastrophic disclosure, I think, would look like some major event like Phoenix Lights, except now that everyone has cell phone cameras, there's just too much data. Because I posted an HD video. I investigated the guy down in Australia. I asked Ross Coulthard to help. He went and met with the guy. He did a background investigation on him. Everything. We spent several months. The video seemed amazing. All of his claims checked out, but it was immediately mocked as a fake video. There's no way to prove it. Any one video cannot be proven true. I've learned it doesn't matter. You would have to have like one mass event like that, and then just so many thousands of people with their own cameras from different angles, different viewpoints, especially with AI and everything. So I think one event like that could change the game, and that would make it okay. Now we've moved into catastrophic disclosure. The other way would be some event like that happens or not, and then the president comes out and says, yes, this is true. Because I don't think anyone else, they won't believe anyone else. They won't believe any whistleblowers. We've seen so many whistleblowers come out, there's so many, but they're just relegated to I don't know. People just don't believe them. David Grush seems so credible, gave so much detail. It's corroborated by so many other people. CIA directors, Chris Mellon saying we have extra. He knows we have videos from space. John Ramirez saying he's literally gotten remote viewing analysis. Jim Semivan, trusted people. So people who've had their own direct encounters with these things. It seems like any one of those people is not going to change the game. Ultimately, I think it would take literally the president standing up there and saying that. And I just don't see that happening unless it's forced.
Speaking of catastrophic disclosure, let's say it happened tomorrow. What do you think the biggest immediate danger would be of that?
Danger. I don't know. Usually that is the main question. Is everyone's like, what are the negatives? And I asked Jim Semivan, what are the positives? And he seemed surprised by that question. Actually, He's like, oh, I mean, I think right away it would. And I honestly think the reason that they don't, if it is true and it's been a giant conspiracy, and what it means is they have literally classified science. And so I think for a lot of people like me who believe the mainstream scientific narrative and believe our government, is doing everything for the general good, finding out that they'd been actively lying and keeping that quiet, new technologies. If you watch David Grush's interviews, actually, he gets the angriest when he's talking about that they kept science from the people. He talks about astrobiology and astrophysics. And you'll see like that's when he gets really angry. Is he talking about they're lying about science? They lied about the science. So I think that would be the biggest danger. Is my suspicion is that any new technology, once you figure it out, it's not difficult necessarily. It's very difficult to do fusion in tokamak reactors, right? With our current understanding of fusion, to hold something that's 20,000 degrees Celsius in a gaseous form magnetically in this large machine, that's very difficult. And so Iran and our enemies probably aren't going to be able to do that right before us. But let's say that our understanding of fusion is incorrect, as Eric Lerner has proposed. On Demystify Psi, they also proposed that our understanding of what fusion is and how the stars actually work, if that's incorrect, then it could be very easy actually to do fusion. I mean, relatively, not that maybe you're doing it in your basement, but like a high school kid could theoretically do fusion. The one-off super smart high school kid could do fusion in his basement if it's just a misunderstanding of the underlying physics and assumptions. Now you destabilize the whole system, right? Because then for sure, nations like North Korea all of a sudden could have a working fusion device. Iran could have easily a working fusion device, or any rogue tribe theoretically in Afghanistan. So any of one of our enemies could all of a sudden have access to just incredible power. And so that immediately equates to incredible weapons, right? Because of course that's what the nations are thinking of when we say national security. It's not the security of the people, right? Like national security doesn't mean the security of all the people, because I look at any war, right? People are obviously expendable. I was paid to be expendable as an F-16 pilot. So the people are definitely expendable, but the nation is not, right? The national security means the security of the nation. So my suspicion is that's what it is about. And if you could look back as well, that's kind of when everything went off the rails, was back in the 40s and 50s, right when this started. And Nikola Tesla, right? He's a great example where his work was classified, literally taken by the U.S. government, and it hasn't been released. And they say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. All of it hasn't been released. But I believe that all of it hasn't been released. So why would you still classify Nikola Tesla's work? And he was even working on some sort of crazy weapon, right? That he called like a plasma weapon. So, yeah, I think the problem is if you say that, oh, by the way, this is real, and yes, we have this crash retrieval program that Jake Barber has alluded to, and David Grush and Bob Lazar, and the list goes on and on. If that is true, then what it means is, okay, how are they getting here? They're using some alternate form of physics that we currently don't understand. And if that's easy, right, if it's not so difficult to do those programs, then you would immediately destabilize the current world order.
Right. And so there's kind of like two schools of thought when it comes to this. Either there's those that think that the craft in the sky that are being identified doing things that defy physics are owned and operated by the American government or other world governments, and therefore we have the technology and it's being used and it's being suppressed by the people, or it's ET technology that exists. We know it's there and we can see it, but we don't know how it works. What do you think is the more likely scenario?
Well, I think if you have one, it predisposes the other one to exist, right? Assuming I haven't just been wasting my time for 5 years, and assuming all the, I don't know, hundreds of people I've interviewed weren't lying to me, I think it's a mix that, you're probably going to see what's out there. So that would imply that there are extraterrestrial or some other form of life or intelligence that we don't understand interacting with us. And then you're able to, as Jake Barber says, to lure and capture that, or you find crashes and then you reverse engineer the technology, which is probably very difficult. But that's what we did. I worked in the U.S. Air Force, and I was an aggressor. That these planes actually, those are the aggressor paint jobs up in Alaska. And the job of the aggressors is to analyze the enemy and then replicate them. And so, if you can get your hands on enemy equipment, that would be the best, right? If you could buy, if there's some secret dealing or steal it or whatever, then you can reverse engineer that weapon system, And the best is to have your own one of those weapon systems, build your own, and now you can train against it. And this has been going on for probably forever, I would guess, as long as humans have been fighting. So that would be the ideal, and we already have reverse engineering programs of other systems. But now you're talking about completely different technology. I think it'd be very hard to actually reverse engineer like an entire craft. I think, although that's the argument, right, made by Bob Lazar. And I interviewed Gregory Rogers, NASA flight doc, and he said he saw a video at Cape Canaveral of a working, looks like flying saucer, using some sort of electrostatic propulsion or something. But it seems like that would still give you great benefits in the civilian sector, right? So if you kept that information secret, right, which I mentioned already, why you would do that, you don't want to completely upset the entire world order, right, or give all your enemies access to cold fusion. Then you keep it quiet and you work on it on your own, and now you can drip feed these advances out to your civil society, right? Like the CIA gave Google Maps to Google, I believe. You also have nitinol, right? That's the famous bendy metal. You put nickel, add nickel to an alloy, and now you have memory metal. That was after Roswell. Lasers, all these UAP anecdotes, they're always using some sort of light or laser beam. So you could argue that, yeah, they saw lasers working and were able to reverse engineer some sort of human equivalent. I've also heard semiconductors. If you actually see a computer system or some working, say you just pick out some machine that some sort of central intelligence unit in one of these craft, and then you see that it's made out of semiconductor equipment, that would tip you off to try and reverse engineer like your initial silicone computers. So there's a lot of negative outcomes, and the positive outcomes are just not there for nations. I don't think there's a good outcome for any nation, all the people, yes, like we say, it's our right, it's my right, as we talked about, to know that I'm not alone in the universe, that we're surrounded by other entities all around us, if you will, or maybe even there's life after death, right? Maybe we find that out from this, or maybe they already know. There's all these inklings from the CIA, the Stargate programs about consciousness going past death, etc. But the nation doesn't care about that. The nation doesn't care whether you and I are happier about knowing our existence or something.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. I've noticed some of your recent videos have been examining this idea of suppressed technology, and there are many reasons why something like free energy would be like withheld from the public, even though there would be numerous benefits. But there would be winners and losers in a situation like that, where and we're going back to Tesla, similar technologies as to what he was working on. We know that they were stolen and made classified. Who would be the biggest winners and losers if something like free energy were released to the public? And what could be like the moral argument for keeping that under wraps? Is it just an economic thing, like the whole economy would fall apart and it would actually have a negative effect on people? We also mentioned the security issue, or is there a deeper reason? Is this because it really touches on the nature of reality in a profound way that would be kind of altering to our reality? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's definitely winners now, right? If the technology, if it's all correct, basically the arguments that I think we're proposing. If you look back in time in the 1500s, so I live in Portugal, and they figured out in the late 1400s how to actually get around the southern tip of Africa. And you actually have to go way far west. You have to almost cross the entire Atlantic Ocean. That's why they ended up in Brazil, because they hit the edges of Brazil. You have to go so far west to get out of the currents, right? And then get the correct wind. And now you can actually come and whip around the southern tip of Africa. And so they had that information. And there's no way they shared it with their arch rival, Spain, right next door. There's no way. And they immediately became the richest country in Europe, probably the world, because they just did terrible things, just pillaged, pillaged and raped all of Asia, who was just this peaceful, rich society. And these barbarians basically came in with cannons and guns and swords. But I guarantee they did not share that information. And they didn't share it with people in their society, because then that information is going to get back. I bet they didn't even share it with people on the boat. I think the maps of where they were actually going was kept just on with the captain and the navigator, and maybe a few key like people. But they're definitely not going to share that information, because they're gaining the advantage, right? If the nation knows that this is true, then they have freedom of movement. So if there's any crash or any sort of event down in South America, for instance, you've heard of all these events down in Peru, with Weygant. You have Mike Herrera said there's an event in Indonesia. You have James Fox, Moment of Contact, his whole documentary down in Brazil. So all those are American assets essentially there, and I would assume to collect this technology, right? It's a very advanced technology. You have an immediate technological advantage, and in war, that's your number one advantage, right? The U.S. still has an advantage over China, even though China has 5 times the people, at least 4 times the population, and that's based on technological advantage, right? I'm sure they could fight as mentally hard as we could, right? But if you just have higher technology, we've shown in modern war that that's the winning hand, right? That's your trump card, is technology. So this is extremely advanced. So if you know that it's true, and you've effectively convinced the rest of the world and your populace that it's not happening, now you can effectively go all the way around the southern tip of Africa, and you're there out of nowhere, becoming the richest nation ever, right, on the planet. And so if it's true, they are winning now. Like, they're winning. So no matter what, they lose that advantage, right? If this comes out, if the president says it's true, aliens have been here for many years and we have crash technology, you immediately lose that advantage, immediately. So, and that's just getting back to neutral, right? That's just losing the advantage that you already have. Now everyone else, they're not going to let you just show up in Peru, or Brazil, or now you're going to have definite teams, all across the world. Right now, other nations are going to try to get this technology as well and keep it secret. So I really think it comes down to national security. That's what it comes down to, and there's just no benefit to us, to you and me knowing. And I think that the other point you mentioned is, what is it? Is it epistemological shock to everyone's system, or ontological shock, a complete paradigm shift? That's just a good excuse. Like, that's just a handy excuse to make it, to sell the decision, to the other people, right? All they have to do is say, think what it would do to modern society, and by the way, we would lose our technological advantage. So yeah, I think it has to come from the community. I don't, and we haven't seen the aliens, right? That if there are aliens here, they haven't just come out like a Phoenix Lights event, right? All they have to do is sit over New York City for a day, spend more than a day over New York City, and all of a sudden it's proven. But they haven't. And so, I have my own views on that. I think they're not going to interfere like we wouldn't interfere in a tribe in Papua New Guinea. I think they're probably not going to interfere either. But then still, yeah, you don't know.
Yeah, we haven't really touched on the ET side of things. What do you think, I don't know, a civilization looking at Earth would think, with the behaviors that we display, with the way that we live, with the wars that we fight and geopolitical situations? Like, what do you think the interpretation is about us humans?
I think it's just nature. I think it's human life, not human life. I'm sorry, Earth life. I'm finishing the final edit of a book called The Fractal Universe, and I think as humans we tend to we think too much of ourselves and we separate ourselves from nature. But what I believe is, what I already mentioned, I alluded to, was I think nations are living entities, and basically, like anything else on Earth, are trying to survive. Um, and so, from my viewpoint, looking outside, I think aliens are not most likely, or extraterrestrial life is probably not going to look like us, or maybe not even be at our dimension of size. So, I think nations, I believe, and I think it'll be shown true, in the next, I don't know, 50 years. Probably take a while for people to accept it, but I think nations are actually living entities on Earth. If you look how they act just like any other organism that's out in the jungle, and we're confused as we look up, like, and I think it's, to me, it's blatantly obvious. But it took, for when they could see microscopic life. That was in 1683 when they saw the first, animal in a microscope. It was Van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch scientist. That was 1683, but it took 200 years before doctors started washing their hands. So they knew that there were tiny little microorganisms, and yet they still attributed all these effects, right, to things we didn't understand. They still, for 200 years, I mean, you couldn't figure it out. 200 years, they still thought that people got sick because of spiritual reasons, or miasmas, right, or like bad air or evil, right? You, God bless you because you may get sick because of evilness or something. So they attributed microscopic effects, to things we couldn't understand. And so that's how I approach the UAP problem. Is I think we're attributing a lot of these things. It could be due to other dimensional entities that we don't understand. Maybe the reason that it's all telepathic and it's all communicated through us through these realms of consciousness, if you will, is they're not at our size scale. What if they're bigger? I'm sure if you if you inject like antibodies or a vaccine into your body, right? Those vaccine cells are probably going to look really weird compared to like a normal healthy living cell in your body, but they're there for a purpose, to actually do something. But I think they wouldn't look normal. I think they look different. You hear that a lot too. Like David Grush said that these entities, they had biologics they talk about. And he said in one of his interviews, maybe more, that he doesn't know if they were ever alive. So it's like, it's a biologic organism, but he can't say whether or not it was ever living. So it's like some sort of animatronic type of biological entity. You also hear that a lot of people that come in contact with the ships, I mentioned Weygant, a lot of these people say that the ship is actually an entity. Like Jake Barber, when he was carrying, I believe it was a box actually in a helicopter. It wasn't the egg, but it was a different object he was carrying. And he had this telepathic communication with some entity that I assume was in the container he was carrying with his helicopter, brought him to tears, etc. But in that instance, it was almost like whatever the object in the container was communicating with them, through some sort of telepathic means. So I guess long story is I have this very in-depth, detailed view, but I think it comes down to dimensions other than our size. And you asked about how they would look at Earth life, and I think they wouldn't look at humans as single entity. I think they would look at the largest organisms on the planet. I think are going to be like your nation states, and I think they behave like anything else on this planet, which is basically kill or be killed.
That's a really interesting take. I've actually never heard of anybody talk about nations as being like living entities, but yeah, if you think about it a certain way, it does make sense. Kind of like how you can think of a planet as a living entity with all of the organisms that live on it.
Yeah, that's the James Lovelock. He had the Gaia hypothesis, and so I think it's just an extension of that. Yeah, I think the analogy, once you see it, is blatant. Nations have membranes, just like your body does. We have decision-making entities. Look at your executive bodies. They're essentially like a neuronal network. You have like one idea, and then it goes through filters until you get to a final decision. Look at your roads; they're transporting around nutrients, and look at how you actually communicate. Right, it's communicated through power lines, through internet cable lines, which literally look like nerve lines in your own body. You have immune cells. I mean, we call them terrorist cells, right? So I think, and they live and die. Exactly. New nations are formed, and they're they grow quickly. They're adaptable. And then what happens after? Looks like around 200 or 300 years. Like when the U.S. was formed, was a very different environment than it is now, right? I mean, they were formed with slavery, right? Slavery built the U.S. essentially. But now it's a totally different world. And now, the people that founded the U.S. couldn't imagine the world that we live in now. And so I think what you see, though, is that the bureaucracy and the systems that were built at that time, they're getting old. You have corruption. Like it's like they even say like an old empire, crumbling, if you will. It's like, it's old, it forgets, it fights over stupid things, and will ultimately die, right? No nation is going to live forever on the planet, and they reproduce, they have metabolism. So anyway, yeah, I think to me, it explains a lot. And then it could also explain these weird effects that we're seeing from UAPs. Because like when a policeman comes to your door, right, and knocks on your door, you see a human, right? but it's not really who's knocking on your door, is it? You know, it's the city or the
It's the
state.
police. Yeah, it's not this man or woman, it's the police.
It's the larger entity, right? Like if the FBI knocks on your door, that's the federal government is coming to knock on your door, right? You're not just going to slam the door in their face like it's your neighbor that you don't care about or whatever. You're going to listen to them because yes, you see a human there, but what's actually interacting with you is the federal government, right? It's a higher level entity that is interacting with you through an intermediary. So I think that's what we could be seeing from these like strange UAP encounters with these aliens is like we see like an alien, which are often weird, right? They say the encounters are very weird, but I think it could be some sort of intermediary um, from another entity. So larger entity or a different entity, not in our actual dimension or not in our size dimension. Maybe it's a larger size. It could be smaller entities. I don't know. But either way, I think it would explain a lot of the weird interactions we see. And I think that it'll take us learning to actually see macroscopic life for what it is before the actual world will change. You know, when will we not have war? I think we'll not have war when we can convince the nations that we exist down here, that humans are worth not expending, right? That it's not worth sending other humans to die, you know, because like I just killed like 1 million of my hand cells, you know, but I really don't care. We would have to convince the nations that it's in the best interest of them to also care for us and not send us to go shoot each other. So what I see is that we'd have to really understand the macroscopic life out there that I believe exists and we can see it. So, and I do think it relates to UAPs. Yeah.
That's a very interesting take. Is there a particular discovery that you found very surprising or unexpected that you made through any of your interviews or through the community on your YouTube channel?
Particular discovery. I mean, I had so many like paradigm shifts. I don't know. I guess I'm just not I don't know if I was ever really afraid of death, but now I'm not afraid at all. I guess. You know, if war is your business, then death is your business. You really get used to it after a while, and if you're willing to take someone else's life, I think you have to be willing to give your own. So you kind of come to terms with death, talking about it every day. But really looking into this subject, and I find that there must surely be something else. The reality that we're seeing right now is just a minuscule, very small part of the universe. I think it's much grander and larger than we can possibly imagine. I'm not worried at all about death or if the world blew up. I'm sure we're surrounded by billions of worlds. So I guess that's what I'm most surprised about is my own mentality changed to where I guess I just think there's much more to existence than what I thought when I was growing up and just thought it was just this materialist world and we're just gonna, you know, it's gonna end when I die or something.
Final question. What do you see as being a win moving forward with regard to the disclosure efforts, with regard to information about the true nature of reality? What would you see as a victory for the people moving forward? Let's say over the next like 5 years or something like that.
Yeah, 5 years, a lot can happen. It's 2027, right? That's the year John Ramirez said everything's going to happen.
There's been a lot of years thrown out.
I keep hearing 2027. A win. I tend to think that we're going to get a lot of wins all at the same time. You know, it seems like breakthroughs you know, this it builds up, builds up, builds up, and nothing can change, nothing can change, nothing can change. But then if you get kind of that one major point, you know, I mentioned that if the government, I believe why they will not even admit there's any non-human intelligence is that would like start the domino train. And I think no matter what, they're not going to be able to stop AI. So I'm very optimistic actually that we're going to get a lot of breakthroughs
You
definitely
think that's
within
the
in the next
accelerant
5 years.
that's gonna just kind of like put everything into like overdrive and kind of like move us through this more quickly is AI?
Without a doubt. Yep. I think we're going to get so many breakthroughs. It's just going to keep accelerating. And we're going to realize that our science has been total bunk. You know, we're already, I get a lot of comments on my channel. You know, people seem really distraught and they say like the world is falling apart, or, you know, they're very negative on the world falling apart. And I think the world was always like that. It was always messed up. At our level, you know, the jungle, imagine living in the jungle. You're like a little tiny insect. You know, it's a violent world out there in the jungle, you know. Um, I think it's always been that way. And I think what's changing now is that we're just seeing more. We're getting more knowledge of what's actually going on. And so I don't think anything's failing worse than it has in the past, actually. I think the opposite is we're going to now see amazing breakthroughs, fantastic knowledge. You know, there's just too many coincidences. I've covered a lot of these on my channel. There's so many physics related coincidences just with the math. And there's this general consensus that we really know what we're talking about. And it's just not true. If you really look into it, and I mean, I literally mean all of our science, all of our knowledge, all of it. When you go down like 3 levels, you know, if you just like a kid, you know, if you just ask why like 3 times, you will undoubtedly get to an answer where, because that's the way it is. And that's across all of our sciences. You know, there's so many things we have no clue about. You know, we don't know where inertia comes from. I think that's a pretty big physical problem. Like, if you don't know where inertia comes from, you really can't say that you know anything about physics. Like, you can't say that space-time or any of our theories on physics are in any way accurate if you can't say what is the source of inertia. You know, why do things weigh things? Why does anything weigh anything? You know, we don't know why there's radiation. We don't know why a nucleus radiates. You know, you've heard about all these things all your life, right? Like, oh, that's radioactive, that material, uranium. But we don't know why. We have no idea why a nucleus suddenly radiates. You know, and I just found this out this year. Like, and I was a material scientist. Like, if a neutron is out on its own, right? If it's not inside of a nucleus, it just disappears in 10 minutes. It turns back into a proton and an electron and some like anti-neutrino. It'll just disappear, right? We don't know where consciousness comes from. We have no idea. Like, we can't even devise an experiment that tells us what consciousness would be. Like, we can't even think of an experiment for like why I have a conscious experience. That's like the one thing I can prove, at least to myself, is going on. Like, this could all be, everything could be fake. You could totally be fake. All of this could be fake. At least I know I'm having an experience. Like, something is happening to me, even if everything is just a simulation. And we can't even think of a experiment. We can't even think of a way to test that in any manner. You know, so there's huge holes in all of our science. And one other example is, which I love, and I've thought of this recently, and no one even considers it. But we have pretty good evidence, right, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, based on carbon dating, all that. And so we say that stars are 10 billion years old, right? We say the sun is 10 billion years old. Well, like red dwarf stars, they can live trillions of years, actually, in our current model. Okay, so the Earth is almost 5 billion years. Our sun is 10 billion years. And yet, like, we say this and believe it, is that the entire universe, right, this giant, unimaginably large place, is less than 3 times the age of our planet. And they say it with wonder. They're like 13.8 billion years ago. Like, it's so long. It's like, dude, billion years is nothing. Like the Earth is 5 billion years. And do you know how tiny the Earth is compared to the galaxy? It's nothing. It's actually 10 to the 7 meters, and the galaxy's 10 to the 21 meters. What is that? 14 orders of magnitude larger. And yet we really think, and they say this, and our smartest people and our astrophysicists and people we give Nobel Prizes, they really believe that the entire universe is 13.8 billion years old. And yet the Earth is only and the Earth is 4 billion years. It's so ridiculous. So yeah, I see that all changing. And when that changes, I think when people can be more open-minded to realize that all these things that we think we knew were totally not true, then I think they can come to these serious questions of, okay, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of UAPs? What is the nature of consciousness? And then I kind of see us then getting a win to where we'll understand this phenomenon.
Cool. Well, Chris, I think we're getting there step by step with conversations like this one and the ones that you're having on your YouTube channel. So I encourage everybody to go check that out. Where else can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, my YouTube channel is my main channel, so it's just my name or Lehto Files, and you can write emails there as well. That's where I mainly am. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everybody who watched. And just reminding you again, Unveiled is available everywhere, all the podcast platforms. So please follow us, leave your ratings and reviews, subscribe on YouTube, and all of those good things. And we'll be back again soon. Thanks, everybody.